Welcome back to another episode of the Frustrated CEO podcast. We are so glad that you joined us for episode 43. It's going to be a really good one today. And of course, I am not doing it alone. I'm doing it with my friends and colleagues, Patsy Freeman. Patsy, welcome to you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Good to have you back. And then, of course, our other colleague, Leb Tannenbaum, who is here to introduce our guests, talk a little bit about what we're going to do, and then launch us into our show today. Leb.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. I'm excited. So I am here to introduce Ranjeeth Thunga, and I am excited, Ranjeeth, to have you here to be with our listeners. Ranjeeth is passionately interested in the issues of human conflict. He has been educated at Johns Hopkins University with a degree in psychology. He has worked in technology startups where he has experienced and personalized conflict on a personal level, an organizational level. And instead of stepping away from what we've talked about as the pain of conflict, he has leaned into it to see how we can do better in this from every level you can think of. He's a coach, he's a facilitator, a lifelong learner. His passion for resolving human conflict extends to global, national, organizational, and personal work with leaders at all levels, people in all countries and conditions. And it's so necessary. So we're really happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leb. And thank you, Patsy and Patrick, for having me on this program. I'm looking forward to sharing insights. And this work is taking a turn this coming year. So it's a nice time to put this work out there and to talk with all of you and share insights together.
Yes. So let's get going with, here's something that's been on my mind. I'll ask it as a question. We've seen leaders who really shy away from conflict. Mm-hmm. They kind of would prefer if it didn't happen at all, or prefer not to lean in it and recognize that there's a conflict here and there's something that needs to be done about it. And, this is your lifelong work. So if I'm a leader and I'm listening to this and I'm recognizing, or I'm thinking, I know like there's this team in conflict, or these two departments in my organization that are in conflict, or I have a conflict with someone on my team and it's unresolved and there's a lot to be lost in that lack of resolution. What are some of the first steps? I mean, what do you say when you get introduced to a leader and say, oh, okay, let's start here?
Yeah. So then I would say the first step is very self-evident, but we don't acknowledge it. And that's to start within ourselves. So conflict starts from within ourselves. And how do we tune into ourselves? Well, that's another question, but it starts with a commitment. It starts with a commitment to look within ourselves to reconcile the conflict that we're experiencing. So it's not about trying to fix them or trying to solve their conflict or trying to help them get along. It's more about starting from within. And when we're working on the conflict within ourselves, the conflict on the outside, this is time-old wisdom. This is eternal wisdom here. This is not something new that I've discovered. It's something that we all know on some level. Dealing with conflict starts within our own hearts, within our own minds and within our own hearts, within what we feel within ourselves. And a commitment to work through conflict from within ourselves, which we have very conveniently two very powerful principles of tuning into God or source or truth or whatever word you use to describe a transcendent power that's within all of us, whatever our belief or non-belief, tuning into that. And second is a commitment to love our neighbor as ourselves. And even though we know these, we conveniently leave off certain parties, the people that are inconvenient to love, the people that are inconvenient to understand. So it's a commitment to these. The commitment is central because without that commitment, we might learn a bunch of theories, facts, knowledge, ideas, frameworks, etc. But there's a commitment that is essential because it takes us through the processing of conflict, which is ultimately an emotional issue that we experience within our own hearts. So that commitment is the key. And from there, we can have meaningful dialogue and discussion as it relates to conflict on all of the different levels.
Uh-huh. Yeah. It's similar, actually, in the consulting work that we do, because if the leader is really not truly committed, at some point in time, we just don't get where we know we can.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes, it's a bit of a blind commitment. So if I'm saying to you, I'm just playing right now with this is, okay, Ranjeeth, I'm committed, but I don't know exactly what alley I'm walking into or what it's really going to take. Do you talk about that as well? Like, this might be painful. This might cause you to look at things you don't want to look at, or deal with things you don't want to deal with.
Yeah, it's a reminder. I mean, what we can do, of course, is we can remind each other, we can encourage each other. Of course, the commitment come from, and like you were sharing, it entails pain. It entails like physical, visceral pain in our bodies.
Hang on a second. You froze?
Yeah, he did.
Okay, you froze. Can you go back and start that answer, and then we can edit and tighten that out?
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Sorry, you froze for a second, and we didn't hear you.
Okay, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I understand.
No, it was important.
So we can support each as it relates to conflict and the commitment. So we feel like we are committed, and we can support each other in that commitment. But that commitment involves us realizing that this is going to be something that we're going to feel. We're going to feel the conflict within our own body. We're going to feel uncomfortable feelings. We're going to feel awkward, uncomfortable feelings that we might not even be used to. And we might think like, okay, no, this is not feeling comfortable. Let me step back. But that is actually, without realizing that this is actually a sign that we might actually be growing into something broader. And what I mean by growing into something broader is developing a broader perspective. We might have had a worldview or a perspective our entire life, but to deal with conflicts, we need to be able to broaden our perspective, and that's going to feel uncomfortable. And that commitment allows us to ride through the uncomfortability.
Yes. Yeah.
Ranjeeth, first of all, thank you for joining us today. I think this is it's a timely topic. Not honestly, this almost feels like this is an evergreen episode, because wherever you have collections of people, you have conflict. When we set out to start this show, right, when we launched this show, we thought the Frustrated CEO podcast, that's the name. We wanted to address the issues that frustrate CEOs, that keep CEOs awake at night. And we know, conflict is one of those things. And I think we've all encountered leaders who they get frustrated by either the conflict or the lack of conflict resolution, all the issues that come with that. And the focus is on the conflict instead of, to me, I think part of resolving this is shifting the mindset. I learned this in marriage class years and years ago, that conflict is a great thing. Conflict actually tells me that you're invested, right? It's the absence of conflict when we have issues, and it's the same in a marriage or in a relationship and in the business. When there are issues and people aren't entering into conflict to negotiate or not fight about it, but to work together to resolve it, to be invested, they go to this place called withdrawal or disengagement, and the issues are still there. They've just disconnected emotionally. Have you? I see you nodding. Is that your experience? How have you seen that? Yeah,
and I've seen it. I totally. We it's too much. It's too much. And if we look at conflict on our planet, it's just so much. And I feel like not just on an individual level, but on a social level, like, why aren't we treating these? We're on the precipice of the destruction of the human species. Like, that's where we are. And we feel this is so overwhelming that we basically check out from actually looking at conflict and how can we address some of the issues that we're experiencing. And yes, it's good. It's good to feel conflict. And I have some bold statements I sometimes make. Sometimes we should be feeling more pain. We should even be feeling more trauma, because that is just like what you shared, Patrick. That shows that we're actually engaged. And I look at, I mean, I have some perspectives that might not be conventional, but if we're experiencing great pain or great trauma, it's because we care about what's happening, and that's something that we can lean into, and we can we can discover. And a lot of times we don't realize that these feelings that we're feeling, these sensations, are actually information. They're actually intelligence. We could even say our feelings are actually intelligence. Of course, we have the concept of EQ, but I feel like there's a little bit more we can get into by actually treating the feelings that we're having in our body as a form of intelligence, and using that as a way of guiding us. And one of the keys also is to, which goes along with this, is that, okay, like, it's not just pain and trauma, there's also gentleness and grace. To be able to be gentle and graceful with ourselves and with each other, which is a natural consequence of actually feeling the conflict very powerfully within us. That, whoa, this is so intense, like, I'm going to ease up in terms of my judgments of others, in terms of my projections of others, in terms of my judgments on myself, and be much more forgiving. And I think through this process we actually evolve spiritually as a human being.
Yeah, and to finish that, I realized I gave a half a thought that conflict is a great thing. It's not the conflict that's bad, it's how we work together to resolve it. That people don't do that disconnecting emotionally right away. They do that when the conflict isn't safe, like when it becomes unhealthy, how we punish each other trying to resolve it. So how do you help people, teams, organizations navigate through the conflict in a healthy way to keep them at the table, willing to push through that pain and that those feelings? That's hard stuff. How do you keep them at the table so that they don't disconnect emotionally and then go into conflict avoidance?
Yeah, that's a good question. And a lot of the work that I've done over the past several years with clients and with individuals and groups is to map out their perspective, as we were talking about, or as we'll be talking about a little bit in the course of this conversation. And mapping out our perspectives means to give space for our perspective and other perspectives to be seen, to be expressed, to be felt even, and creating an open space where our perspective is legitimate as well as their perspective is legitimate. And by perspective mapping, it's a very, very simple premise. It simply means mapping out how we experience the world, our goals, our vision, our outlook, our lifestyle, our practices, our journey, and that of others. And through this process, we'll find commonalities, we'll find common ground that we can use to say, hey, wait a minute, we're actually not separate. And one of the very beautiful examples with two family members that I had worked with a few years ago was mapping out their perspectives and a common framework in a way that it's their perspective, the different parties involved, the perspectives were not individuated, like they were in the same map. And there's something called an overview effect, which a lot of astronomers talk about. When they see the Earth from a vantage point where they see the entire planet in one view, something shifts within them on a very powerful level. And many astronomers, from what I've heard, have described the same phenomena. And same with perspectives. When we can see a perspective, we can see perspectives and we can see them together instead of like one versus another, then we're going to be able to, a shift can happen within ourselves.
Yeah. It's making me think of how often leaders may actually have to deal with some conflict that they may feel is pressure. And, I'm thinking about when I worked in a public company. Well, when you work in a public company, there are shareholders. and the shareholders expect a return on whatever money they've invested to purchase the shares of your company. And if so you get this potentially, maybe on a regular basis, you're dealing with profit and you're dealing with purpose and maybe doing what's right.
Mhm.
And so there's a conflict there potentially
Yeah.
as the leader. Have you run into some of those kinds of things where there's some way to at least recognize and maybe balance the pressure that comes
Yeah.
along, or the pain that comes along with being conflicted?
And I think that that's and one of the premises of my work, and by work I mean in this context of the inner work, from the meditation and contemplation perspective, is to give space to allow whatever we feel to 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 be felt, and not to push a feeling into something else, or to call it what it isn't, but to simply be honest with what we feel. And the pressure is real. The pressure, what we feel, is very, very real as an experience. And so to own that, to acknowledge that that's what we're experiencing, and then use that, kind of like we were talking about earlier, that you were mentioning, Patrick, is using that as a way of, okay, like how can we work with it? How can we work with it? And what that pressure can inspire us to do is find out and discover our priorities more clearly. And of course, conflict is ultimately, I look at it from the internal perspective, and sometimes I break it down into external conflict and internal conflict, but really it's all internal conflict at the end of the day, as I see it. And so what it forces us to be clear what our priorities might actually be. And a lot of times, because we have conflicting perspectives within ourselves, like as a husband or as a wife or as a parent or as a child or as a teacher or as a CEO, like we have different roles, and they might, and of course from other perspectives, from a legal perspective, a psychological perspective, a spiritual perspective, we have these different perspectives. They don't always cleanly match. Like in my church, I might learn one thing. In my psychology sessions, my therapy sessions, I might learn something else. In my legal proceedings with my conversations with my lawyer, I might have a different perspective, and they don't necessarily align. And that's one of the challenges I had in, as it relates to my own journey. In my college, I had a conflict at a college job, and it was a powerfully painful conflict, which has dramatically shifted my own perspective in my life. But we had various perspectives intersecting with each other, and they didn't necessarily reconcile with each other. Different systems had different perspectives: the academic perspective, a legal perspective, the HR perspective, the team perspective. So then what this pressure, this gets experienced as pressure within ourselves. So then, and by owning that pressure, then we have to force alignment. It forces an internal alignment. Okay, what is actually the priority here? And I think that that's where the transcendent principles come into play, of loving God or source or truth, and loving each other as ourselves. Like we can use them as uh, a way of tuning ourselves to be able to make decisions that will uh, use that pressure um, to find a new way of aligning our priorities. Um, if that,
Mhm.
if I was able to capture that. So
You started talking about different perspectives, different places not always meshing and coming together. And I think
yeah,
sometimes a lot of conflict is rooted in differences of, sometimes it's differences of opinion.
mhm,
Sometimes that conflict is rooted in real foundational differences in belief.
mhm.
How do you how do you navigate through that as a leader? You know, what, how do you navigate through real, I mean, it's not easy to get someone to change a belief.
Yeah,
I don't think that's the intent of
yeah,
conflict resolution, is to change
yeah,
anything.
yeah.
So what do you do with that?
Yeah. That's a great question, and they're very deeply held beliefs that we have, that all of us have, and we all should stay true to what we experience to be our core beliefs. I feel like we are blessed as human beings. There are principles that stand transcendent of our particular beliefs, and the two principles that, of course, that I've shared. These eternal principles are irrespective of whatever particular beliefs we might have. And so so that's our saving grace, in my opinion. Like we there's a place we can tune into, or there's a voice we can tune into that is higher than our particular perspective. So when there's conflict, we can tune into that, and I think that's where a spiritual practice is so essential. Whether we call it a spiritual practice or not is not the point, but we need a practice where we tune in to ourselves or within ourselves to be able to stand from a place where it's above, you could say, above the different perspectives at play, and to be able to navigate these challenging situations in a way that's not reactive. And I think that's a very key point, which I hope we can talk about a little bit, is that whatever our beliefs are, however deeply entrenched they are, the most important point is not whether our belief is correct or not, as far as I see it, and this is as far as this work goes, but it's our reactivity to other points of view. If we're able to, it's the maturity with which we handle our perspective that is far, far more important than our actual perspective. And the reality is that in our world, we don't have that many role models that can demonstrate this. We simply don't. If we look at our political leaders, or if we look at our many other leaders, I feel like in some areas there's been more growth. I think in business there probably is a greater pace of evolution, because there's a certain rubber hits the road. I don't know what it is, but in some areas that there's more of a growth that's happening. And I think in other arenas, like in the political sphere, it isn't, where our reactivity is actually our selling point. Like if we get very reactive towards a particular issue, we actually are inspiring people to react by voting for us. Maybe that's what's happening. But if we're committed to reconciling conflict, we're standing outside of our particular beliefs. We're actually interested in learning other beliefs. We're actually interested in learning other perspectives more than selling our own. And that's kind of the shift that happens within ourselves, as I see it.
So if you could help, I mean, what you're almost talking about is a counterintuitive move. I mean, if you look at the myths around leadership, especially from a CEO perspective, it's like decisiveness, toughness, have all the answers. And I imagine, at least when I first started looking at this issue for myself, and I imagine for people listening, it seems like a huge gap to get to this place you're talking about, which is your heart and taking an outside perspective. Could you dissect it a little bit, and like, where's the first kind of baby steps somebody could start to take?
Yeah. And I'll share like the most baby of baby steps.
Yes.
Is and this is common knowledge, like almost everything that I'm sharing, but it's a reminder that we need to give each other, and that's simply taking a breath and simply taking a pause. And there was one study that I came across, which I don't have the reference for, unfortunately, but it was that a quarter of a second pause between when we hear something and when we respond makes all the difference in the world in how the communication moves forward. And that quarter of a second pause is simply that little break. And I think that in one of the podcasts I had heard, I'd gone through a few, I think you had mentioned, Patrick, or someone else mentioned about the gap between the stimulus and response.
Yes.
And it's and we can do it just simply by taking a breath. We can actually start to subvert our reactive tendencies within ourselves, and a different aspect of ourselves comes forth. That's of course it's not just one breath and that's it. It's of course over the course of our life that we engage in such a practice. But that's what I find.
Right. But a quarter second can lead to a half second, lead to seconds. So I mean, there's a way that you can start to build on that.
Yeah, totally.
So that you can, meditate for a whole minute.
Yeah.
All right. So go ahead.
There's a spiritual philosopher, Ken Wilber, whom my work is very much inspired by. His philosophy is called integral theory, and he is looking to put together knowledge and insights from different sources. And one of the things he had shared, which stuck within my mind, is like if we can meditate for 1 minute, like 50% of the work is done. We got 50% of the benefit of meditation from the first minute. I think this probably applies to a lot of things in life, because I notice when I start activities, anything that I might need to do or I haven't done in a while, like just that starting is, and I'm sure many of the CEOs in the audience relate to this, like just starting whatever it is that might have been like stuck is like 50% of the work is already done just by getting started. So I think that applies here.
It reminds me of a few episodes ago, we had Jamie Dixon on. He talked about allowing the emotion to flow through you before you move forward. But that just opens up a whole other conversation. Okay, so take a breath. What are some of the other practical steps that a CEO or can either do or teach to make them better in this area?
Yeah. And I think that then is tying back to what we were talking about with some of this, just the simple things that we can do. Of course, starting with the breath, that ensuring that we are dealing with our reactivity, our desire to just do a jerk impulsive reaction. And from there, it's owning our perspective. And going back to what you were sharing, Patsy, about the different models like of leadership and of how a CEO might present themselves, or a leader might present themselves in a certain way. And then like this kind of what might seem to be a subversive approach. I believe that the first step is to own our own perspective. Like at the end of the day, regardless of how important it is to learn from others, like we start with owning our perspective first, and then the perspective mapping, by mapping out our perspective through a process of introspection or conversation with someone who can ask you pointed questions. Of course, that's something that I do as well. We can start to map out who we are as a human being, and then from that place of owning our perspective, we can make space for other perspectives. We can listen to and take little bits. Okay, I can't absorb. You're coming from a completely different angle here. Like, I can't, like, I've been in many circles of conversation where just the other group has like this completely different perspective. I can't take that all on like immediately, but I can take something. And like we're talking about that common ground, I can take something. Okay, wow, they're concerned about their family's well-being. They're concerned about their safety. Well, so am I. Like, I can take something and I can relate it to my perspective. So I can share that with others as well. So I think that graceful, gentle approach, like we can take something, we can be a little bit more present in the moment. We can always do something, and we trust that and we can rest in the fact that this is a lifetime process for all of us, like including and especially me, I would say. But we can continue to take those little steps.
I love that. I mean, finding some common ground gives you some place to stand rather than standing so far apart and hanging on to really strong beliefs that separate us. And so if you're working with a leader and they're running meetings and they know that there's conflict to be dealt with, would you actually recommend that it's okay to pause and ask maybe everyone in the room to just breathe and reflect for half a minute?
Yeah, I think it's a very beautiful, and depending on the corporate culture, that might be more avant-garde or more like out of left field. But I think things are changing so rapidly from my own whatever pulse I have on the corporate culture, that this is probably something that could be very much would be invited in 2022. So yeah, I think that's great. I think that would be wonderful. And people, I think you had shared some stories a bit ago, Leb, like to me personally about but the appreciation when people feel like that they're understood, that they're listened to and understood, like it can make a world of difference. And what I call perspective mapping is simply that, like in maybe a little bit more formalized form, but it's simply understanding, and that not just the understanding, but the willingness and the desire to understand, like that goes a long way. It goes a long way.
It makes me also think of so often in conflict that we've been around, um, people are in conflict around the what or the how, um, and not asking the questions about why.
Mhm.
You Right? So,
Mhm.
like, what should we do? Or how do we, how do we need to get through this? Or how do we need to get to this, customer or all? So there's a lot of what and how that I notice. But then sometimes when somebody says something that like might trigger me, I could ask a why question.
Mhm.
Help me
Yeah,
understand.
yeah, yeah.
Help me understand why that's important to you. Help me understand, why you believe that so strongly. And
Yeah.
if you don't do it like you're making them wrong,
Mhm.
that you really do wanna understand, what's the why in that? I just don't quite understand yet.
Yeah. I think and that, to me, there's just two sides, of course. Like, why can be felt as, and it can come from a place of like of judgment. Like,
Yeah.
why are you
Mhm.
you know why are you throwing your socks in the middle of the room every day? Like, why are you like leaving the door open in the bathroom and letting the heat escape or whatever? I'm just throwing stuff out there, but I mean, these are the funny. It's funny because these are the real life examples.
Yeah,
Like,
we
Yeah.
can all relate. Yes.
so those are and like it's like a challenge, but the why that comes from the place of, look, I want to learn. Like, I really want to
Right.
learn. And I think what when you were sharing, like when it hit me when you said, like, when you were tying it in with their experience, like, why is it that this is important to you, like that. I think that is a beautiful place, like when we're looking to understand. And love starts, I believe that love starts with understanding, and I look at it from that perspective. So with conflict, of course, like, we don't use the word love so much, and especially in the corporate language, but we can start with we can use the word understanding. And I think that and then we can even the desire or the intent to understand, that just, like, I think it pays dividends. And I think you've shared some examples as well, in the corporate culture. So yeah, so I think that's
Does some of the mapping
what we can do.
help people identify what they think the enemy is or who they think the enemy is? Um, I mean, to some degree, the enemy is anything that gets in the way of, your transcendent self, your spirit, God, and and love. But
Yeah,
eh, it made me think in business. Like I've been in business meetings where they talk about a competitor like the enemy,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
We have to tear them down, and we have to gain full market share. And it's like, yeah, but I don't know how that fits in, but I have heard that mantra that come up, and it feels like war. It doesn't
Yeah,
it doesn't feel like healthy competition
Oh,
that might bring out the best in everybody.
yeah. And you already mentioned politics. That's kind of what it feels like. It feels like
Yeah.
each side sees the other as the enemy.
mhm. Yeah, 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 yeah. And we have that, and and a lot of corporate culture, I think, like, we can, over the last several decades, has been that premise. And I think it's, I mean, I can, like, my whatever finger of the pulse on the pulse I have, um, leads me to believe that it's shifting, where we're having a much broader definition of other entities. Like, there could be, and we see this, of course, like, this like the collaborators could be competitors, could be whoever. But as it relates to conflict, and the conflict that we feel inside ourselves, that that there's something that's, and this is just the state of I believe the state of maturity of our world right now. We're trained and programmed since we were a, a, a young toddler to see us versus them. Like, we're trained that way, so it's going to
Mm,
percolate and translate into our education, into our clubs, into our sports, into our business, into our families, like that us versus them, which, in my opinion, like, is very, very beautiful when we're bringing out the best in each other. When that's the purpose, becomes very ugly. And it and the financial, if we're looking at the bottom line from a purely financial perspective, we might say like that might be more effective. And that's why I think that the transcendent principles are really important. Our organizational values, yes, but even above that are the transcendent principles that can remind us that, okay, like at the end of the day, they're human beings, they have families, they have needs, they have desires, they have strengths, they have qualities that they want to express in the world, just like we want to express in the world. And yes, it will challenge us in ways that are not, that might go against what we might have learned. Like one of my friends used to always say, they don't teach you that in business school. Like that might not be something that they teach in business school. But if we do hold on to these principles, then I feel like within ourselves, so much conflict can be worked through our systems, the transcendent principles. We can hold on to them as our primary master, then a lot of the conflict that we experience can be worked through, which might actually rub up against established notions of how we should perceive our competitors.
So you've mentioned a couple. So we've spent a large part of our conversation so far talking about how I can do that as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
And in the last few minutes, you've mentioned culture, values, organization. How would a CEO start to build this into their organization's culture?
Yeah, and I think that that it starts with it sounds cliche, but of course it starts within ourselves, and by demonstrating these qualities within ourselves. I feel like that's the way that it can get translated in, and it can be in across the board in terms of how we map out our policies and how we map out our procedures and how we map out our guidelines, like embedding that within it, and not as a directive, and not as a by fiat, if I'm using that word correctly. And the examples I can think of, there's a institution I had dealt with where they would declare these ideals, but like as for actually doing anything about them, like no, we're just, and they stand by them. They're so proud, and they're so like yes, we are standing for diversity, we're standing for inclusion, everyone treated with equality and respect, equity and respect. And but then when it came to the actual behaviors, there's nothing. I mean, like in my opinion, at that time, at least, this is a few years ago. So it starts from embodying these qualities on an individual level. I know that a lot of there's a lot of value, I think, also in like having each of our values tied with PKIs, like is it PK performance key
KPI.
performance KPIs. And there's actually work that I've done on a language called strategy markup language, and it's a language that can help us, you could say, put into standard data formats an organization DNA, their vision, their mission, their goals, their objectives and values.
Yeah.
And the part of the intent of this project, which I feel like it probably didn't reach that stage of fruition, and I hopefully at some point it might. I'm not involved right now, but it's to be able to use that as a way of understanding each other, like as individuals and as organizations. Okay, what is the organization's DNA, you could say, or their strategy in this form? And what we have to do right now is we kind of have to. It's written as an afterthought, and I think a lot of times, like the organizational principles are an afterthought, or as something that is something that sounds pretty or that reads nice, but to actually embed that within the DNA of the organization with KPIs and and of course, from my perspective and my work, it's the starting from within ourselves and what our own experience and our own what we're bringing to the table in terms of our reactivity emotionally. That's those are the ways that I could share.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Ranjeeth, what do you think are some of the bigger inhibitors of conflict? I mean, of good conflict resolution in the business. What should a CEO be looking for, looking to identify, and then either remove if it's an inhibitor or better educate. And maybe it just comes back to the same. We need more emphasis on these transcendent principles. Where do you see your experience? What are some of the bigger inhibitors of doing this the right way in a business?
Well, I'll start with the wrong way, which I've experienced in my life, and that's the okay. Like, this is the source of the conflict. Let's eliminate them, and that is a way of creating a situation. Of course, we have the examples we see of, like, we surround ourselves with people who agree with us, and we know, like, the disaster that can come. But we look at it in one sense. But I think that in other spheres, we look at it. We're still doing that, and we're doing that in a way that we might think we're actually creating a peaceful and harmonious environment in such a way, but we're not looking at what we might call, or who we might call, the instigator of conflict is actually a catalyst that can share insights. An outsider, for instance, someone who doesn't fit into the company culture. Like, a lot of the work in company culture from my experience and understanding is finding the right fits, but also very important is, of course, finding the misfits, and those misfits actually encourage us, if we listen to them and if we give them weight and if we give their perspective weight, they can actually share a tremendous insight into our organization. So it is painful. It's tough. It's
Yes.
tough.
That's really good.
You just turned up the heat there.
Yeah, totally. And I'm speaking from experience being that misfit, of course, as well. So there's a personal connection there as well. And being someone who's on the fringes in many ways, like, I feel like by not fitting into many of our institutions, I feel like I have a unique value to play as well. But the challenge is, of course, is to be able to include these voices.
That's fantastic. It reminds me of we've done some work with a tool called the ladder of inference, and we've studied the failure of the NASA launch, where a lot of people lost their lives when one of the spacecraft blew up. And the instigator, or the misfit in making that decision, was the O-rings engineer, who said that it's too cold to launch. If we launch below this temperature, but there was a multi-billion-dollar or million-dollar contract at stake. And it went so far in terms of misfit and disbelief that the launch manager, who didn't want to be publicly embarrassed by not launching on the date that everybody was going to be watching, and all the TV cameras and all of that, yelled at this misfit, shut him down completely, and said, are you saying that it's not okay to launch within spec? Are you changing the spec at the last minute? And the truth of the matter was, later on, as you pick this apart, is that the spec went down to 32 degrees, something like that. And they were launching at 19 degrees, and they were out of spec, and it didn't even come up. So the other thing that I think you're talking about here, about hearing the misfit, is sometimes there's really important data that just gets completely thrown out or ignored in conflict that could actually lead to a better resolution.
And a lot of it, I think, like, just going back to what you said earlier, Patrick, like, we don't want to we throw out we don't want to feel the conflict. We don't want to experience the conflict. Like, and if we can embrace it as actually informing us, then we could prevent situations like what you described, Leb. And I've seen these type of situations. I've been on the other side as well. Like, don't rock the boat. Like, we're all swimming up to here, and as we've heard, like, and if we rock the boat, like, it's disastrous for all of us. And this come from a lot of it. We need to look at it from a very compassionate perspective as well. Like, we're all swimming up to here, basically, like, in our world, and what we like to do is, of course, point the fingers at those who might they need to be exposed. They're the perpetrators, or they're causing all of the problems. Well, well, like, be compassionate. We need to work in a graceful and a gentle way, because it's very difficult with so many forces and so many voices and so much pressure, um, and not we're all growing human beings. We're figuring it out every single day. Like, we're all figuring stuff out. Like, so to kind of be easy on each other, uh, and uh, and uh, and just work with each other, and slow. And that's what I've learned over time. Like, with some of my work earlier in my life, where I was more trying to be in people's faces and trying to be gung ho and trying to step in between people and say, you guys got to stop fighting. And then instead of fighting against each other, they both turn their heads and their faces towards me. So yeah, there's, I think, a certain grace and gentleness that we can look at this, and compassion. And I think that a lot of times we celebrate indignation way too much right now in our current climate, and compassion way too little. When to actually work through conflict in a real way requires far more of the compassion, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to hear about what are some real, maybe it is time to move into, let's get practical. What are some real practical, some real practical support?
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned meditation, you've mentioned a few other things, but so with myself or with my team or with, my organization, what are some ways that we can start to practice and build that into our interactions?
Yeah, and I think those are definitely fundamental. Like, of course, like establishing we're all committed to this principle of wanting to understand each other, like, as much as we can. And we are starting with the premise, okay, we have certain tools that we can develop to give us the space to actually hear what each other is saying. Like, okay, we have meditation practice or prayer practice or whatever practice we might have. We can introduce this. We can start to explicitly introduce this. And I think corporate culture is changing to where these are not words that we're not allowed to use anymore. These are actually words we can, and actually we probably should be using. So we can formally bring these up. We can formally say, I want to understand you, just that desire, that commitment. I want to understand you. And I am wanting to work through this conflict with you. And the premise that, and this, of course, as a leader, we start with understanding the other as our premise, not to be understood, but to understand each other. So starting with that, and that inspires. I feel like that naturally inspires, like whatever understanding we make for others naturally inspires others to understand us,
Right.
and at their own time. Again, being gentle, and we're not trying to force anything. We're trying to uncover what is not just our individual conflict, but we have conflict on all the different levels, and they're all what we experience. So allowing this process to unfold, I think
Right.
that, and encouraging that we're not going to get quick. We're not looking for quick answers. We're not looking for instant solutions. This is a process, and this is a process that might even outlast our relationship with each other, like in our organization.
Mm-hmm.
But we're
yeah, I think what you're getting at there, I don't think we are natural. Some of us maybe, but most of us, I'm overgeneralizing. I think a lot of us, let's say that, a lot of us are not born knowing how to navigate through conflict in a healthy way with someone else. And that's why a lot of us just avoid it.
Mhm.
And my encouragement is with leaders, senior leaders, and frontline people alike is, it's like any other skill. The more you do it, the more experience you build. You're going to make some mistakes. So I like where you said grace and for gentleness, and not just giving each other grace, but give yourself grace when you do it wrong.
Yeah.
You can build that muscle and become quite good at it. You just have to be willing to take the step, right? And try it and enter into the conflict, not avoid it. Because I also think avoiding conflict, you can build that muscle pretty well too.
Yeah, right. Yeah, totally. And I have people in my life, business and personal and professional level, like, and I'm not saying them. They're in my mind as an example, and but yeah, there's like a certain dodging away from particular topics. There's a particular, like, let's not talk about this. This is outside the context. I think in this day and age, like, it's healthy, like a business and like the mixing business and personal life. I don't say that they necessarily should be mixed, but they should certainly be acknowledged within each other. Like our professional life should be acknowledged within our personal life, and our personal in our professional, so that there's space to be a full human being. And I think that if we like say like this is not appropriate for now, we might be like on one level, like on a very what seemingly practical level, we're keeping the focus on what's in front of us. But on an emotional level, and of course, like ultimately is an emotional issue, like we're actually shortchanging their humanity in the process. We could very well be saying like your humanity doesn't important. Like this is how I want to see you. This is who you are. And maybe in the past we might like just suck it up. But I think as we're moving forward, we'll be less likely to, or less willing to say, hey, wait a minute, they're not acknowledging my full humanity. Well, I'm not going to be here any longer. And rightly so.
It prompts another question for me. If you're a leader, if you're a CEO, at some point, maybe you've done a really good job. You've been graceful. You've been compassionate. You understand the differences of beliefs and assumptions and opinions.
Yeah.
And then a decision has to be made because you're the CEO.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would want to say to that CEO in terms of recognizing we need to move forward? It requires a decision, a policy. I'm thinking of COVID. I'm thinking about, people not coming into the office. I'm thinking about politics in the office or politics external that come into the office. And at some point in time, you have to make a decision. I remember being in a meeting once where people were talking about physical safety. And what got revealed was that some people had concealed carry weapons permits and others carried guns for protection in their vehicles, and the vehicles were in the parking lot.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about when it was down to the point that one or two people were left in the office and it was dark out.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the winter, it gets dark early.
Yeah.
And some people were like, of course, I want to protect my fellow worker, and I want to have my gun, access to my gun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And everything got poured out on the table. And then the CEO said, I have to make a decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it was actually acceptable to everybody, which was, I can't tell you to not carry whatever you want to carry in your vehicle, but I can say we're not going to park those vehicles in our parking lot. You're going to have to find another place to park. And there were plenty of other options around that particular headquarters. And people accepted that. Mm-hmm. And certainly you couldn't conceal and carry inside the building.
Yeah.
But it was not an easy decision.
Yeah.
I think people saw that it was a compassionate, well thought out, everyone heard, the differences of opinion and the biases and beliefs. Mm-hmm. And fundamentally, they moved on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's really nice anecdote you shared, Leb. And I think that I'm very much, that's been my experience as well, is that when people felt like their perspective is taken into account, like magically the guard drops, like the in your face, like this is my this is my you're not this is my position and this is what I want to happen. Like a lot of that just drops, and we see what the real issue is. The real issue isn't the difference of perspective. The real issue, or the difference in belief, the real issue is actually like, are we being seen, felt, and heard? And I find this in a political rally. I had some conversations. This was a few years ago, but it stayed in my mind, like between protesters on the two sides of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and they were very happy that I was simply wanting to hear their perspective, and they were so happy that, in fact, these are some of the people there were very staunchly entrenched in their particular perspective, but they were happy that I was listening to and hearing their enemy's perspective as well. Like, so there's something that we can even, like, we might not even, if we can, that respect goes beyond just us being respected. When we feel like we're respected, we want to share that with others as well, and we see the value in that, and lots of things, magical things, can start to happen, I think, if we start with that premise. And so, yeah, we'll make tough calls, like the understanding and empathy for the CEO, like for making a call that, that's difficult, but that person did, like, hear the different voices and take them into account and acknowledge them, and I think that makes all the difference.
You made me think of one other quality, Ranjeeth, which is the courage it may take to be empathetic, to be compassionate, to pause and listen, to, open your heart when maybe you've been trained to just be strong, or whatever the case may be.
And that's a redefinition of, I think there's a redefinition of strength that we're kind of coming to, and a redefinition of leadership, like a little bit we talked about.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Good. Any other questions? Because I think we're nearing the end, and maybe we'll turn our focus to the Let's Get Practical. But I want any other questions from the
Not for me. I'm good.
Yeah, me as well.
Okay. Yeah, same. And this was great. Really good stuff. I have 2 pages of Let's Get Practicals. So let's turn our focus, as we do at the end of every episode. This is the part where if nothing changes, nothing changes. So, Ranjeeth, what can a CEO do? 2 or 3 things that you can think of that a CEO can do to improve in the areas that we've talked about?
Yeah. So I don't want to reiterate some of the things, of course, I've shared.
No, you totally can. This is just a recap. That's 100% what this is. 100% what this is. Yeah.
100% reiteration. All right. So, okay. Well, fair enough. I think inviting meditation and contemplation, giving it a legitimate place in the organization, space for ourselves to process, and from the lens of conflict, or from the vantage point of conflict specifically, a space to process through our reactions, to invite different perspectives, to have meetings, one-on-one or groups meetings or organizational meetings, where perspectives are invited and integrated. Not just invited and just brushed off, but invited and integrated, mapped out, acknowledged, and including perspectives of those we might feel uncomfortable with. And this could be some examples. Of course, competitors is one example. Terminated employees is another example. Those might have been involved in some sort of employer grievance. Those are some examples. And coming from my background, like these are things that were not done, like in some of my own personal conflicts that I've experienced and I've witnessed, and I've worked with organizations. They just don't do these things, but so much richness are in these perspectives, so much, like and inviting them in, and we're looking beyond our individual perspective, beyond our organization perspective. We're tuned into these common, universal, eternal principles that can guide us and can move us through conflicts. And we establish that within our corporate organizational culture, starting within ourselves, starting with how we personally respond to different perspectives? The rubber hits the road. How do we respond to a challenging perspective within ourselves? And we learn from each other. We learn from each other. We grow from each other. We can even share our maps with each other. What do I understand about you? What do you understand about me? Wow, like they're actually quite similar. Oh, wow, you see a completely different me than you. And I think some of this work has been done like in a more cut and dry process, but very important. Again, like we're looking to bring out the best in each other. We're looking at each other as human beings, and we're looking to understand each other in a way that is indicative of the common truth, the common ground, the common source. And I think that's where God's source truth is very important, because that's the ultimate common ground. Like we acknowledge that we share that with each other. And I don't think that it can be anything, it could be misunderstandings, but through these different approaches, we can bring a real joy, and we can see through the conflicts that we experience, not pretend that they're gone, but see them through.
That's great.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Lever Patsy, you want to go or you want me to go?
I think you should go.
Okay. I have several I'll do a couple and then I'll circle back. So we'll circle back around and give you another chance if you think of any others.
Okay, sure.
Yep. This is just a great point for so many great points. Here's one. Just a reminder for a CEO or any leader that avoiding conflict with someone is in a way diminishing their humanity. That by entering into conflict, you honor them and what's important to them. I think that's an important reminder. Sometimes we think we're avoiding conflict and we're doing them a favor because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I just love how you flip that upside down and said, no, actually by avoiding conflict, you're not honoring somebody's humanity. I won't take this one because I know you guys will. Let's see. Oh, I love this. The feelings in your body when you're dealing with conflict, it's a form of intelligence. Listen to it and pay attention that it's informing you with valuable data. So pay attention to that. I thought that was cool. Let's see. You don't build high performance organizations by getting rid of the source of the conflict. You eventually end up surrounded only by like-minded people, which is disastrous. I think that was your word. So I'll pause there. I have more, but I'll pause so as to leave some good ones for my peers, and then I'll circle back anything you forgot. So, Patsy, why don't you go?
Kind of a tag along with what you just said, Patrick. Remember, we're all trained for the us versus them perspective. So that's kind of like the ground we start with. So we've got to remember that this is shifting that.
That's good.
One baby step you can start with is increasing your breath by a quarter second and then adding another half second and until you are breathing more fully.
Yep.
It's not just about the pain that wants to move through our body when we are addressing conflict. It's also about grace and forgiveness. So I'll pass it to you, Lev.
Wow, we've covered a lot. Let's see. I would start with pay attention to being reactive and be doing whatever it takes to not be reactive, to allow for whatever's happening to happen. And certainly breathing was mentioned and is part of that. I love the idea of actually allowing for the misfit, the other voice, even if it's a lonely voice, and actually, honoring that. person, that voice. Um, I think also I heard you saying, look for the common ground. You know, when push comes to shove, we all have some common ground. And if we look for that, I think it's really helpful. Um, Another one was, you know, rather than pointing the finger at someone else, begin by pointing the finger, you know, at myself right here. What's in my heart? Why am I feeling this way? And then the last one is that, you know, embrace the discomfort that can come with conflict, and just embrace it. It's part of being alive. And it made me think of one other thing, that as a leader, it's okay to have emotions. You know, there's more than just being strong and decisive.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
Good addition.
Anyone else want to add any others? Ranjeeth, you any more that you want to add? Go for it.
Sure. I'll add a couple of comments to what you've all shared. And with regards to like shortchanging one's humanity, I sometimes use the word perspective, and I think that there's different words, just that they might click in different ways for different people. And so sometimes if people use one word versus another, like it might not click for them, and then I find like, okay, like, but this word clicks. And so then so with humanity, sometimes in some contexts that might not be invited, but then I use the word perspective a lot, which means exactly the same thing.
Perfect.
And then as it relates to breath, and the form of meditation that I do it's called Anapana meditation. It's based on, and it ties in with what's called Vipassana meditation, which is awareness of breath and awareness of sensations in the body. And the practice of meditation involves us simply being aware of what's actually happening in our body. So then the center of gravity shifts to actually what we're experiencing. And it's and the way I practice it, and of course there's so many different types of meditation or approaches, but the way I practice it is simply to be aware of my breath in any given moment. And then that awareness grows. So I just wanted to share a little bit about meditation that I do. And then as you were mentioning, Leb, you're saying something about the common ground, and I think that the common ground, as it relates to the transcendent principles, like of God or source or truth, like whatever our belief or non-belief, that's the ultimate common ground. And whatever practice we do to tap into that gives us access to the common ground through which we can experience others within our own feelings. That's the empathy. We actually feel another's pain within our own sensations in our body, and that comes from tuning in to the transcendent. So yeah.
Beautiful.
That's great.
Great.
Patsy or Leb, want to add any more?
I'm good.
I'm good too.
I the only other one I wanted to add, that, and I'm glad you said the Misfits one. I thought that was great. That was really good. Ranjeeth, you talked about how a major shift in your perspective can happen by not looking at each perspective one at a time, but laying them on top of each other and looking at them all together.
That was a good one.
And it's just, you know, it's a practical thing that a leader can do. Just to improve their perspective.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And us versus them, like you were saying, Patsy, and we're so programmed. And be prepared for tectonic shifts within our perspective, where we see boundaries between us and bad guys like start to break apart. And
it can be confusing, right? When suddenly the enemy is really not my enemy. Like we have commonality. It's confusing.
It's very disoriented. But
good. Ranjeeth,
can be disorienting.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If someone is interested in learning more about you, the work you do, perspective mapping, what's the best way? Here's the part where give us a website. How do we find out about you?
Sure. So perspectivemapper.org is my website, and I'm going through some updates right now, but my mailing list is there. So please do, if you do connect with this work, to sign up, and we are offering a variety of membership benefits, free as well as paid, and as well as we'll be working with having conversations with people of different perspectives in this work. Moving forward, it'll be an activist focus to this work of bringing in different perspectives and finding that common ground. And if you want to learn more about me, there's my website, ranjeeththunga.com, just like how it's, of course, spelled on the screen. So
Well,
that
okay.
contains all my contact details, etc.
Excellent. Excellent. Good. Anything else for the good of the cause, Lab or Patsy?
No, I'm
Ranjeeth?
so grateful
That was great.
that you're here. And this is an important topic. It probably doesn't get any more important than topics like this. So I hope that our listeners tune in and are taking away some of the Let's Get Practicals. And I just really am grateful that you came.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to be here. It was very nice to talk with all of you and to share perspectives and to grow in the process myself. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you. And yes, listener, you can find this episode's Let's Get Practical, as well as all of our Let's Get Practicals on our website at thefrustratedceo.com. Definitely go there, download it, and don't just read it, but actually pick one thing, just one thing that you can implement that to help you grow in this area. Because as we say, if nothing changes, nothing changes. Thank you again. Thank you to my colleagues. You're wonderful. Ranjeeth, I'm glad you were here because we were going to have a big fight, the three of us, but since you're here, we were able to avoid it. So I appreciate that. But yes, thank you for sticking with us to another episode of the Frustrated CEO podcast, and we'll see you next time.